Have you been taking your vitamin B12 every morning for years? Maybe it's a cheap tablet from the drugstore. Maybe it's the B12 in your daily multivitamin, or the fortified cereal you were told was a smart choice. Your doctor nods approvingly at your checkup. But then your blood tests come back, and your B12 levels are still low. Every single time. And nobody seems to explain why. If this sounds familiar, you are not alone. Millions of older adults take vitamin B12 every single day and absorb almost none of it. It's not because they're taking the wrong dose, it's because they're taking the wrong form. The 2026 Senior Food Pyramid addresses this directly. After the age of 60, the stomach often loses its ability to extract B12 from most supplements and even from most foods. The solution is specific, it's cheap, and it's almost never mentioned in a standard medical appointment. If your B12 levels keep coming back low despite taking supplements, this video will explain exactly why that's happening and what you can do about it. Now, this is an educational video, and it's based on the 2026 Dietary Guidelines and published absorption research. B12 deficiency can have serious neurological consequences that require medical management. So, please do not adjust your supplementation protocol without first consulting your healthcare provider, especially if you're on medications that affect your stomach acid. All right, you know the conversation here is always direct. So, let's start with something most people taking B12 have never been told. That supplement sitting in your medicine cabinet might be doing almost nothing. Not because B12 doesn't matter. It does. Profoundly. It's crucial for your energy, your nerve function, and your red blood cells. But the bottle doesn't tell you the most important part. The part that actually determines whether any of that B12 reaches your brain, your nerves, or your blood. B12 deficiency is one of the most underdiagnosed conditions in adults over 60. Conservative estimates suggest that between 10 and 30% of older adults are in the deficient or marginal range. But here's the statistic that should really stop you in your tracks. A significant number of those people are already taking B12 supplements. They buy the bottle, they take the pill every day, they check that box on their to-do list, and they are still deficient. This isn't a compliance problem. You're doing what you're supposed to do. It's a biochemistry problem, and it's entirely solvable once you understand what's actually happening inside your digestive system. See, B12 absorption is unlike any other vitamin. Every other water-soluble vitamin you take, like vitamin C or the other B vitamins, can diffuse across your intestinal wall through relatively simple mechanisms. B12 can't do that. The molecule is just too big, too structurally complex. The body had to evolve a dedicated two-step system specifically to extract and transport it. And that system, unfortunately, starts to degrade with age in ways that standard supplementation just doesn't account for. So let's break down how this system is supposed to work. When you eat B12 in food, whether it's from meat, fish, eggs, or dairy, it comes attached to protein molecules. The first step happens in your stomach. Your stomach acid, specifically hydrochloric acid, has to break those protein bonds and set the B12 molecule free. Once it's free, a carrier protein called haptocorin grabs onto it and protects it as it travels through the acidic stomach environment. Then, once it reaches the less acidic small intestine, the haptocorin releases the B12. And this is where the second critical step happens. A different protein, called intrinsic factor, binds to the B12. Intrinsic factor is also produced by your stomach, and its job is to act like a key, unlocking a special receptor in your intestinal wall to carry the B12 into your bloodstream. 2 steps. Both of them depend on the health of your stomach lining. And for many older adults, both of these steps are progressively failing. The condition behind this is called atrophic gastritis. a gradual thinning and inflammation of the stomach lining that impairs both your stomach acid production and your secretion of intrinsic factor. It affects an estimated 30 to 40% of adults over 60, often with no noticeable symptoms at all. You don't feel atrophic gastritis happening. You just start absorbing less of certain critical nutrients, with B12 being the most significant victim because of its extraordinarily complex absorption pathway. Are you taking B12 supplements and still coming back deficient on your blood tests? Let me know in the comments below, and please share this video with someone who might be in the same situation without knowing why. This is one of the most fixable deficiencies in older adults, yet almost no one is talking about the real root of the problem. Absorption. Now, let's add another layer to this, because this is where the problem can become severe. Medication. Proton pump inhibitors, a class of drugs that includes omeprazole, pantoprazole, and lansoprazole, are among the most commonly prescribed medications for adults over 60. They're used for acid reflux and heartburn. They work by blocking the pumps in your stomach cells that produce acid. That's their entire mechanism of action. And that exact mechanism directly dismantles the very first step of B12 absorption. If there's no acid, the B12 can't be freed from the protein in your food or in many supplements. H2 blockers, a slightly older class of acid-suppressing drugs like famotidine, produce a similar, though less severe, effect. Let me tell you about Patricia. She was 68 and had been taking omeprazole for reflux for 6 years. Her doctor checked her B12 during a routine panel, found it was low, and prescribed a standard 500 microgram cyanocobalamin tablet to take once a day. A year later, her B12 level had barely moved. She was still fatigued. She still noticed that occasional tingling in her feet that had just become her new normal. Then, a gastroenterologist she saw for an unrelated issue reviewed her supplements and made one single change. He switched her to sublingual methylcobalamin, a small lozenge that dissolves under the tongue in the same dosage range. Within 3 months, her serum B12 had nearly doubled. The tingling in her feet had begun to recede. Her energy, she said, felt like it had returned from a place she'd forgotten was even missing. What changed was not the dose. What changed was the form and the route of delivery. The form of B12 found in most inexpensive supplements and in virtually all fortified foods, like cereals, plant milks, and nutritional yeast, is called cyanocobalamin. It's a synthetic, stable form, which is why it's so common. But it requires your liver to convert it into an active form before your body can use it. More critically, it requires that entire intact two-step absorption pathway we talked about to even reach the liver in the first place. If your stomach acid is low, if your intrinsic factor production is compromised, if atrophic gastritis has been quietly progressing for years, cyanocobalamin simply cannot do its job, regardless of how high the dose on the label is. Methylcobalamin, on the other hand, is the active coenzyme form of B12. Your body doesn't need to convert it. It's ready to go. And when it's taken sublingually, dissolved under the tongue, it gets absorbed directly through the mucous membranes in your mouth and goes straight into your bloodstream. It completely bypasses the stomach. The degraded acid environment, the reduced intrinsic factor, the compromised intestinal wall, none of it matters. The vitamin gets a direct ride into your system, with absorption rates that the gastrointestinal route simply cannot match in older adults. In fact, multiple clinical studies have confirmed that sublingual methylcobalamin effectively raises serum B12 levels even in patients with confirmed intrinsic factor deficiency, the most severe form of absorption failure. These are patients whose stomachs produce essentially no intrinsic factor whatsoever, and sublingual delivery still works. That tells you everything you need to know about the power of changing the route. The upcoming 2026 Dietary Guidelines are making a pointed move in this direction. They are recommending bioavailable forms of critical micronutrients for older adults and specifically noting that age-related changes to the gastrointestinal tract require forms that do not depend on an intact absorption pathway. This is a direct departure from decades of guidelines that recommended standard supplementation without accounting for this delivery problem. My fellow health veterans, you and I both know that a recommendation on paper means nothing if the implementation in the real world ignores your individual biology. The practical shift here is specific and simple. If you are currently taking cyanocobalamin in any form, a tablet, a capsule, or from a fortified food, consider talking to your doctor about switching to sublingual methylcobalamin. The lozenges are available at any pharmacy or online. They dissolve under your tongue in about 90 seconds. The cost difference is minimal, but the difference in absorption, particularly for anyone over 60 with even moderate gastric acid decline, is not minimal at all. It can be life-changing. What about food sources? The 2026 guidelines make a meaningful contribution here as well, and it aligns directly with their broader rehabilitation of nutrient-dense animal foods. Beef liver contains approximately 70 micrograms of B12 per 100 grams. That is roughly 3,000% of the daily requirement in a single serving. The B12 in liver is in the hydroxycobalamin and adenosylcobalamin forms, both naturally occurring and more readily retained by the body than cyanocobalamin. Clams are similarly extraordinary, with over 80 micrograms per 100 grams. Sardines, mackerel, and salmon deliver meaningful amounts in the 5 to 12 microgram range per serving. Eggs, particularly the yolk, provide smaller but consistent contributions. The absorption advantage of food-derived B12 over synthetic cyanocobalamin, particularly in older adults with compromised stomach function, is real but not absolute. Even beef liver still requires some intrinsic factor for full absorption. The sublingual methylcobalamin route remains the most reliable intervention for anyone whose B12 levels have remained low despite dietary effort. The ideal approach for most older adults is both regular consumption of high B12 animal foods alongside sublingual methylcobalamin as a daily supplement. One point that deserves emphasis, because it is the aspect most frequently missed in clinical consultations, B12 deficiency manifests neurologically long before it shows up dramatically in blood work. The classic markers, serum B12 below 200 picograms per milliliter, anemia, are late indicators. Early B12 insufficiency presents as fatigue, that sleep does not fix mood changes including mild depression and irritability, difficulty concentrating, memory lapses that feel like early cognitive decline, and peripheral neuropathy, the tingling or numbness in hands and feet that millions of older adults are told is just part of aging. It is not just part of aging. It is, in a significant proportion of cases, B12 insufficiency that has been present for years without anyone connecting the supplement routine to the absorption problem. This matters particularly because the neurological effects of B12 deficiency are progressive and partially irreversible if left too long. Cognitive changes that reverse in the early stages become structural over time. The window for correction is not unlimited. Asking your doctor to check your B12 is not enough if the result comes back in the low normal range and no one investigates further. The optimal serum B12 for neurological health in older adults is generally considered to be above 400 to 500 picograms per milliliter, well above the bottom of the reference range that most labs use. Thomas, 73, had been attributed his increasing word-finding difficulty and his low-grade fatigue to stress and age. His GP had checked his B12 once 2 years prior and found it at 290, described as normal. A neurologist he saw for the word-finding issue ran a more complete panel including methylmalonic acid and homocysteine, two functional markers of B12 status that remain elevated when B12 is functionally deficient, even if serum B12 appears borderline acceptable. Both were elevated. The neurologist switched him to sublingual methylcobalamin and added 2 servings of fatty fish per week. At the 6-month follow-up, his methylmalonic acid had normalized. The word-finding difficulty had reduced noticeably. He told the neurologist he felt sharper than he had in 3 years. If this is landing for you, if you are realizing that the supplement you have been taking may have been doing far less than you believed, write in the comments, "Absorbing what I need." Leave a like so I know this is helping. And subscribe for more content that fills the gaps your doctor's appointments do not cover. The practical protocol is straightforward. Switch from any cyanocobalamin supplement to sublingual methylcobalamin in a lozenge or dissolvable tablet form, 500 to 1,000 micrograms daily. Dissolve it fully under the tongue. Do not swallow it immediately. Add beef liver once or twice per week if your health conditions allow it. Sardines, mackerel, or salmon 3 times per week. Eggs daily. Request a B12 panel at your next routine appointment that includes methylmalonic acid and homocysteine alongside serum B12, so you have the full picture of functional B12 status rather than just the number. If you are on a proton pump inhibitor and have been for more than 2 years, that conversation with your prescribing physician is overdue. Long-term PPI use is associated not only with B12 depletion, but with magnesium deficiency, increased fracture risk, and altered gut microbiome composition. The drug may be necessary, but its nutritional consequences deserve to be actively managed, not ignored. Track how you feel. Energy levels in the first 2 hours of the morning, mental sharpness mid-afternoon, sleep quality, tingling or numbness in hands and feet, if that has been a feature of your daily experience. Write it down weekly for 3 months. B12 correction is gradual and can be easy to underestimate. The changes are real, but they accumulate slowly. Without a reference point, you may miss them. There is a detail about sublingual absorption that most people do not fully appreciate until they understand the anatomy involved. The floor of the mouth and the underside of the tongue are densely supplied with capillaries that drain directly into the systemic circulation, bypassing the portal vein and the liver's first-pass metabolism. When methylcobalamin dissolves against that tissue, the molecule crosses a single layer of epithelial cells and enters the bloodstream within minutes. No stomach acid, no intrinsic factor, no intestinal wall traversal. This is not a workaround or a compromise. For an older adult with compromised gastric function, it is the correct primary route, not the fault. The distinction between methylcobalamin and adenosylcobalamin is worth a brief note, because both are active forms and both appear in high-quality supplements. Back. Methylcobalamin is the form active in the central nervous system, involved in methylation reactions critical for DNA synthesis, neurotransmitter production, and the conversion of homocysteine to methionine. Adenosylcobalamin is the form active in the mitochondria, involved in energy metabolism. For cognitive protection and neurological maintenance, methylcobalamin is the more directly relevant form for most adults over 60. Some supplements combine both, which is not problematic. But if you are choosing a single-form supplement, methylcobalamin is the better supported choice for this age group and for the neurological outcomes most at stake. The homocysteine connection deserves more attention than it typically receives in mainstream discussions of B12 deficiency. Homocysteine is an amino acid that accumulates in the blood when B12 and folate are insufficient. Elevated homocysteine is an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease, stroke, and dementia, with dose-response evidence suggesting that each unit increase in plasma homocysteine above 10 micromoles per liter corresponds to a meaningfully higher risk of cognitive decline and arterial damage. Correcting B12 deficiency with methylcobalamin, particularly in combination with adequate folate and B6, is one of the most direct dietary interventions available for reducing homocysteine in older adults. The Oxford VitaCog trial, which ran for 2 years, found that B vitamin supplementation in adults with mild cognitive impairment reduced brain atrophy rates by approximately 30% compared to placebo, with the greatest effect in those who entered the trial with elevated homocysteine. That is not a marginal finding. The broader dietary context matters too. B12 does not work in isolation. Its primary methylation pathway is codependent on folate, found in leafy greens, legumes, and liver. Its neurological protective functions interact with omega-3 DHA, which maintains the membrane integrity of the neurons that B12 is helping protect. And its energy metabolism role in the mitochondria is supported by CoQ10 and magnesium, both of which the 2026 guidelines flag as consistently deficient in older adults eating processed food diets. The supplement addresses the deficiency. The diet addresses the system. The food source is worth reiterating here because the 2026 Dietary Guidelines frame them explicitly within the context of older adults. Beef liver, 2 servings per week, delivers more bioavailable B12 in one meal than most people consume in a month of standard supplementation. Clams, one of the richest marine sources, provide over 80 micrograms per 100 grams in a food matrix that enhances mineral absorption. Sardines eaten with the bones, which are soft and edible in canned form, deliver B12, omega-3s, calcium, and vitamin D in a single affordable package that the new food pyramid for seniors specifically elevates. The combination of animal organ meats and fatty small fish is not accidental in the 2026 recommendations. These foods co-deliver the specific nutrient clusters that most support brain and nerve health in aging adults. One underappreciated group deserves explicit mention: older adults who have reduced or eliminated animal products from their diet, whether for health reasons, ethical reasons, or simply because appetite for meat has diminished with age, which is common and well documented. This group is at substantially higher risk of B12 deficiency and faces a harder correction pathway through diet alone, since plant foods contain no B12 except through fortification, and fortified forms are typically cyanocobalamin. For this group, sublingual methylcobalamin is not just preferable, it is the only reliable intervention available. If you or someone you know is eating primarily plant-based and is over 60, B12 status should be checked and actively managed. The neurological consequences of prolonged deficiency in this population are serious and not always reversible once the damage is done. None of this is meant to alarm. It is meant to equip. The body's B12 machinery is fixable, reliably, affordably, and with interventions that take about 90 seconds per day. The gap between knowing there is a deficiency and actually correcting it is largely a matter of understanding why the first attempt failed. Now you know. There is also a seasonal and geographic dimension worth acknowledging. In populations living above the 40th parallel, sun exposure sufficient to produce vitamin D is unavailable for 4 to 6 months of the year. B12 has no sunlight pathway, but the point is structural. The nutrients most critical to neurological function in older adults, B12, vitamin D, omega-3 DHA, magnesium, are all disproportionately absent from the modern processed food environment and disproportionately present in exactly the foods the 2026 Dietary Guidelines have reintroduced: organ meats, fatty fish, full-fat dairy, eggs. The new food pyramid is not a collection of isolated recommendations. It is a coherent response to the gap between what aging biology requires and what the previous half-century of nutritional guidance actually delivered. If you are hearing this and wondering whether it applies to you personally, the answer is to get tested. Not just serum B12. Ask for homocysteine and methylmalonic acid. They are the functional markers that reveal whether the B12 you have is actually working or simply present in the blood without being metabolically accessible to the cells that need it. A serum B12 in the 300 range might look acceptable on a standard lab reference range and still be functionally insufficient for optimal neurological function. The reference ranges on most labs were not calibrated for optimal neurological health. They were calibrated to avoid classic megaloblastic anemia, a late-stage deficiency marker. You want to be well above that threshold, not scraping along the bottom of normal. The testing conversation with your doctor is straightforward. You want a complete B12 panel, serum B12, methylmalonic acid, and homocysteine at your next routine blood draw. If your provider is unfamiliar with the functional markers, you are entitled to ask for them. They are standard tests. They are not expensive. And they tell you far more about your actual B12 status than the single serum number that typically appears on a routine panel. Finally, a word on timeline. B12 repletion with sublingual methylcobalamin in someone with moderate deficiency typically produces measurable changes in serum levels within 4 to 6 weeks. Neurological symptoms, the tingling, the fatigue, the cognitive fog, improve more slowly, often over 3 to 6 months, and not always completely if deficiency has been prolonged. This is why early correction matters. The neurological system responds to B12 more readily in the earlier stages of deficiency than in the later ones. If you have been told your levels are low normal, borderline, or insufficient, that is the moment to act, not the moment to wait and see. Take care of your nerves. Take care of your memory. Take care of the version of yourself that wants to stay sharp, stay independent, and stay present for the people around you. B12 is not an optional supplement for people over 60. It is maintenance for the system that runs everything else. One more thing before we wrap up, because it keeps coming up in the comments of videos like this one. People ask whether they can simply eat more B12-rich foods and skip the supplementation entirely. For adults under 50 with healthy stomachs and no acid-suppressing medications, the answer is yes. A diet rich in liver, clams, sardines, eggs, and dairy covers B12 needs comfortably. For adults over 60, particularly those on PPIs or with any history of gastrointestinal issues, the honest answer is that food alone is unlikely to be sufficient if deficiency is already established. The absorption pathway is too compromised. You can and should eat the foods because they deliver B12 in its most bioavailable natural forms alongside cofactors that improve its utilization. But the sublingual methylcobalamin runs in parallel, not instead. Both tracks at once. If this changed how you think about the supplement sitting in your medicine cabinet, if you are going to make the switch to sublingual methylcobalamin after watching this, write in the comments, "Absorbing what I need." That comment tells me this content is reaching the right people. Leave a like, subscribe if you have not yet, and share this with someone who has been told their B12 is fine while they still feel exhausted and foggy. Fine is not the goal. Optimal is, stay well, and we will see you in the next one.